Imagine stepping into a swamp where the air feels thick enough to drink. The ground is not really ground. It is a wet trap pretending to be a floor. Every step makes the mud breathe. Something buzzes above you. But it is not a mosquito. It is closer to a flying dinner plate with wings. Then the water moves, slowly. Quietly, like something large just decided you looked interesting. Welcome to an ancient swamp, nature's least comfortable waiting room. And for a long stretch of Earth's history, these places were packed with giants, not movie monsters. Not dragons, real animals, built by real evolution, in a world that no longer exists. The main setting of our story is the Carboniferous period. That was roughly 359 to 299 million years ago, long before dinosaurs. Long before flowers, long before anything with a phone could panic properly, much of the tropics was covered in vast swampy forests. These forests were not like modern forests with birds singing politely. They were wet, hot, crowded. And strange, giant club mosses rose like wooden towers. Tree ferns spread their fronds over dark water. Horsetail relatives formed dense green walls. Dead plants fell into the swamp and did not always rot completely. Layer after layer of buried plant material slowly became coal. That is why this period is called Carboniferous. It was the coal age, and yes, the fuel humans later burned came partly from ancient swamp forests. So in a weird way, your industrial history has monster swamp roots, but coal is only the first clue. The second clue is oxygen. Plants take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen. Carboniferous forests were doing this on a planetary scale. At certain points, oxygen levels may have risen far above modern levels. Today, oxygen is about 21% of the atmosphere. In parts of the Carboniferous, estimates suggest it may have climbed much higher. That matters because breathing is not just a detail. Breathing is a body-size rulebook. For insects and many arthropods, oxygen moves through tiny tubes called tracheae. They do not breathe like we do. They do not have lungs pumping air through blood like mammals. Oxygen has to reach tissues through a different system, when the air contains more oxygen. That system can support larger bodies more easily. This does not mean oxygen is a magic growth potion. You cannot open an oxygen tank and become a basketball player. Biology is rude like that, but high oxygen can change the limits. It can make big bodies less impossible. That helps explain one of the most famous Carboniferous celebrities. Meganeura was a giant dragonfly-like insect. It was not exactly a modern dragonfly, but your terrified brain would not care. Its wingspan was around 75 centimeters. That is roughly the width of a large bird. Now imagine that crossing your face in a swamp. Your first thought would not be taxonomy. Your first thought would be a noise your ancestors would understand. Then there was Arthropleura. This was a massive millipede-like arthropod. Some individuals may have reached around 2.5 meters long. That is longer than many humans are tall. The good news is that Arthropleura was probably not chasing you for meat. The bad news is that a giant, many-legged creature does not need to chase you to ruin your afternoon. It only needs to exist nearby, but giant bugs were not the whole story. Ancient swamps also favored amphibians. To understand why, think about what amphibians need: moisture, water, soft places to lay eggs. Places where drying out is not a daily personal crisis. A swamp is basically an amphibian luxury resort. If your idea of luxury includes mud and teeth, Carboniferous amphibians were not just tiny frogs doing their best. Some were large predators with broad heads and strong jaws. Some looked more like crocodile-shaped nightmares than anything you would call cute. They lived near the edges of rivers, pools, and flooded forests. In that world, the waterline was not a boundary, it was an ambush zone. If you were small, the swamp was a buffet. If you were large, the swamp was also a buffet. That is the wonderful horror of ecology. Everybody is someone else's lunch. So why did swamps keep producing large creatures? First, swamps were productive. They were full of plant life. More plants meant more food at the base of the ecosystem. More food could support more herbivores, detritus feeders, and predators. Second, the environment was stable enough for specialized lifestyles. Wet habitats gave aquatic and semi-aquatic animals room to grow. A creature could hide in water, hunt from water, and retreat into water. That is a very convenient lifestyle if you are shaped like a patient jaw. Third, land ecosystems were still being invented. This is easy to forget. Today, land is crowded with mammals. Birds, insects, reptiles, and humans making bad parking decisions. But in the Carboniferous, terrestrial ecosystems were younger. Many ecological roles were still open. Arthropods were already experimenting with life on land. Tetrapods were still exploring what legs could do outside water: predators, prey, scavengers. And plant eaters were all negotiating the rules. Evolution had walked onto land and found several empty job openings. Some applicants became enormous, but oxygen alone is not the whole answer. That is the twist. The old simple story says high oxygen made everything huge. That is partly useful, but it is too simple. Size also depends on food, temperature, predators, reproduction, habitat, competition, and body design. A giant insect still needs to eat. A giant amphibian still needs a place to move. A giant arthropod still has to molt, grow, and not collapse under its own awkward architecture. Ancient swamps provided a rare combination: high productivity, wet shelter, warm regions, open ecological space, and at times oxygen-rich air. Put those ingredients together, and nature starts making creatures that look like rejected theme park designs. But there is another reason ancient swamps feel monstrous to us. They were unfamiliar. Modern swamps have alligators, mosquitoes, frogs, birds, and fish. That is already enough character development for one habitat. But Carboniferous swamps had no flowering plants, no birds, no mammals, no crocodiles as we know them. No grass. The whole world was built from different parts, so even normal animals from that world look wrong to us. A giant dragonfly-like predator feels like science fiction. A 2-meter arthropod feels illegal. A huge amphibian hiding in the water feels like a crocodile from a planet that failed art class, but to that ecosystem. These animals were normal. They were not monsters. They were neighbors, very large, very unsettling neighbors. The swamp did not see them as strange. The swamp made sense of them. It gave them food, cover, oxygen. An opportunity. That is what ecosystems do. They do not build animals for our comfort. They build animals that fit the rules of the moment. And the rules of the Carboniferous were strange. Then the rules changed. Climate shifted. Continents moved. Glaciers expanded and retreated. Sea levels rose and fell. Swamp forests fragmented. Some wet worlds dried. The great coal forests began to collapse in many places. When habitats break apart, giants often suffer first. Large bodies need large systems. Big animals need enough food, enough space, and enough stability. Remove the swamp and the monster factory loses power. As the world became drier in many regions, amphibians lost some of their advantage. Animals with eggs better protected from drying gained new opportunities. Early reptiles and their relatives began to matter more. The future was moving away from endless swamp. It was moving toward drier land. That does not mean every giant vanished immediately. Evolution is not a light switch. It is more like a messy committee meeting lasting millions of years. But the age of the swamp giants was not permanent. The world that built them disappeared piece by piece. And that may be the most important lesson. Giant prehistoric creatures were not random accidents. They were environmental messages. A huge insect says something about air. A coal forest says something about carbon. A giant amphibian says something about water. A monster in the mud says something about the planet that made it possible. So ancient swamps were not full of monsters because Earth was trying to scare us. They were full of giants because the recipe was right. Wet forests trapped carbon, oxygen rose, food was abundant, land ecosystems were young, water offered safety and ambush. And evolution, given enough time, tried every weird idea it could afford. That is both funny and humbling. Because humans often imagine nature as balanced and neat, but deep time says nature is more experimental than that. Sometimes it makes a dragonfly the size of a bird. Sometimes it makes a millipede longer than your couch. Sometimes it puts a jaw under dark water and waits. And hundreds of millions of years later, we dig up the clues and call them monsters. But maybe they were not monsters at all. Maybe they were just the correct animals for a very strange world. So here is the question. If you had to cross a carboniferous swamp, what would scare you most? The giant insect above your head, the many-legged thing moving under the plants, or the silent predator waiting beneath the water?